tonight because I know the Phillies are playing right now. So if any of you are going to follow the score or even watch it on your phone and multitask while I lecture, that's totally fine. I won't be offended. I probably shouldn't tell you about this because if you have any respect for me, you might lose it once I tell you that being a Georgia native, I'm actually an Atlanta Braves fan. So my team is out. I'm good. I get to watch. I love baseball, and I'm watching a lot of playoff baseball right now, but it's all stress-free because I don't care. So, but I know there's probably a bunch of Phillies fans in this room. I know there's a bunch in this school. The students do not mind reminding me that my team's season is over, and I'll just leave it at that. Mets are winning right now, yeah. Well, I wasn't going to say that, but I was watching it while I ate dinner. But to the Constitution, tonight I want to go through the rest of Articles 3 through 7, and then I want to talk about the third major wave of our government going through a pretty significant change in the mid-20th century and the effects that we see from that today. I've picked on the legislative branch and I've picked on the executive branch, and want to be fair and impartial. Tonight I'm going to pick on the judicial branch. It's going to be great. But I have a couple quotes here that I wanted to start with. Alfred Regnery, who's a conservative author, he said, "The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were based on the premise that government was the great threat to freedom." Government was the great threat to freedom. Because historically, prior to the American Revolution, government was the biggest threat to freedom. And the purpose of a constitution was to limit the power of government. I have two other great quotes here. Clarence Thomas, he's a current Supreme Court justice, he said, "Our Constitution, like the Declaration of Independence before it, was predicated on a simple truth. One's liberty is not to mention one's dignity was something to be shielded from, not provided by the state." We protect our liberty, and our dignity is intended to be shielded from the state because historically government made up by corrupt men is going to have a propensity to violate our liberties and our dignities, and so we're supposed to be shielded from those things by the state, not expect to have those things provided. And if you look at our country today, do we not, as a whole, as a society, do we not expect that our liberty is to be provided by the state and that our dignity is to be provided by the state? We're going to talk about that a lot tonight. And then Russell Kirk is another conservative author. He said, "A society in which men and women are morally adrift, ignorant of norms, and intent chiefly upon gratification of appetites, will be a bad society, no matter how many people vote and no matter how liberal its formal constitution may be." That's another version of John Adams' quote that said, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate to the governing of any other." So let's review. In our first few weeks, we talked about the purpose of Republican, little r, not the GOP, but Republican government. That's a Republican form of government, which is to represent the people while also protecting people's natural rights. So we talked a lot in the beginning about the protection from the tyranny of the majority. Daniel, could you turn those two lights down just a little bit? It's given me a bit of that's much better. Thank you. I don't think people need to see me all that well. They can just hear me. So we also talked about the Constitution was a compromise and it was a miracle. So just a reminder, it was a compromise between large states and small states. It was a compromise between slaveholding states and free states. It was a balance between states' rights and federal supremacy. It was a balance of the separation of powers and the checks and balances between the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government. All those things were debated and fought over for months before landing on what became our Constitution. So it was a compromise, and it was attested to by all as having been a miracle. And then we've talked so far about the legislative branch. We talked about the House and the Senate as they were intended to be versus how they are today. And just to review, this whole idea of separation of powers, this whole idea of protecting people from the tyranny of the majority, in the federal government, the House, it was supposed to go in ascending order, directly representing the people, all the way through being very removed from the people, because the idea there was to protect people from the tyranny of the majority. So the House of Representatives was supposed to be the only body that was elected directly by the people. The Senate, who remembers how the Senate was to be chosen? Our senators by the states. So originally the senators were chosen by the states. That was changed by the 17th Amendment. The president, how is the president chosen? The Electoral College, but that's based on popular vote, but every state gets to decide how their electoral votes get counted, or get cast, I should say. 48 of the 50 states, it's winner take all, just as a reminder. So whoever wins the majority vote in Pennsylvania will get all 19 of Pennsylvania's electoral votes, but Maine and Nebraska, they split theirs into districts. Okay, so House is directly elected by the people, the Senate is supposed to be chosen by the states, the president is chosen by an electoral college that's still based on popular vote, but through an electoral college. And then the Supreme Court, which we're going to talk about tonight, is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So in the three branches of government, there's supposed to be this separation of powers. All right, and we talked about the omnibus legislation and the way that Congress goes about its business, and how the House and the Senate, now the Senate does not act as a check to the House. The Senate was supposed to be the elevated body. It was supposed to act as a check to the passions of the mob, if you will. All bills that have to do with revenue are supposed to start in the House, because of the Senate was then supposed to be able to check things against the House. The executive branch, we talked about the Electoral College just now, and then of course last week we talked a lot about the administrative state. All right? And by the way, the Electoral College is more valuable now than ever. And I touched on this last week, and I thought about spending some time on that this week, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But for some people, it can be confusing. And two times in recent history, in the election of 2000 and the election of 2016, the Republican candidate won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. George W. Bush lost the popular vote in his first election, and then in 2016, Donald Trump won the Electoral College, but he lost the popular vote. And you can see how deeply entrenched progressive ideas are in our society when this happens, because people say, well, the will of the majority should be what counts. Okay? If Hillary Clinton won the majority of the votes, then why did Donald Trump get to be president? Because she won 65 to 70% of the votes in Los Angeles. But if we just take Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Houston, the four biggest cities in the country, and we remove the power of Indiana and her 7 electoral votes, and we remove the power of, Georgia and its 15 or 16 electoral votes, then all any candidate will ever have to do is campaign in the largest cities. And every state becomes a flyover state. So the Electoral College, it's again going back to the founders and their intent. It's supposed to be a balance between popular vote, states' rights, state representation, and federal supremacy, all balancing out and making sure that we're not ruled by a simple majority in any particular circumstance. It was the genius of what the founders gave us. At least I think it was genius. All right, we're going to go straight to the Constitution tonight, because I tend to get long-winded about the philosophical stuff, and then I don't actually get to the text of the Constitution, which is what you came here for tonight. And once again, I left my copy over here on the table, so I'm going to come over here and grab it. I'm going to grab this. if you will turn, if you have your pocket constitution, if you want to turn and find Article 3, once again, we're not going to read directly from it, but I'll get us started. So we are on page, thank you, page 12. Article 3. Article 1 is legislative branch, Article 2 is executive, and Article 3 is judicial, and a few other things. Section 1. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme Court and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior, and shall, at stated times, receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Section 2 goes on to talk about the kinds of cases the court hears. So if you want to look at your outline here, I have separated these so that if you kept the first 2 weeks, Article 1 and Article 2, you can just slide this in behind there with Article 3. The judicial branch, so Section 1, we have a Supreme Court. And I have to turn this back on because it turns off at night. And I'm not going to freeze you all out, but it's too stuffy. We've become friends. We can be a little less familiar, right? All right. Number 1, the judicial power is ultimately in the Supreme Court of the United States. You might hear it referred to on the news as SCOTUS, S-C-O-T-U-S, Supreme Court of the United States. We also have POTUS and FLOTUS. POTUS is President of the United States, and FLOTUS is First Lady. Although, what will that be if Kamala Harris wins? It'll still be POTUS for her, but for her husband, it will be First Husband of FOTUS. FOTUS. Maybe we won't have to go deal with that. Section 1, number 2. Congress may ordain and establish inferior courts, and they have, and I'll get to that in a minute. So the only pop quiz question for you U.S. government students in my class, what's the only court provided for in the Constitution? The Supreme Court. Who is in charge of all the other courts? Congress and then the states. Because Article 6 of the Constitution says all laws not delegated by this to the federal government are reserved to the states. So states deal with state courts, Congress deals with other federal courts below the Supreme Court. Number 3, Supreme Court justices and inferior court judges hold their lifetime appointment on good behavior. Why? Why lifetime appointment? Again, we go in ascending order. House of Representatives, 2 years. President, 4 years. Senator, 6 years. Supreme Court justice, lifetime appointment. Because they wrote a lot about the independent judiciary. It was one of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, was that there was no independent judiciary. Remember, most everything they did was a reaction to what they had dealt with in Great Britain, or a reaction to what they read about in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. They were students of history, and they were students of their current political climate. So an independent judiciary was a major lack in Great Britain. It's what led to the corruption between the king and the National Bank, between the king and Parliament. There was no independent judiciary. Judges were very much beholden to political favors, and they were part of the system. So in America, the idea was that a judge is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and then once they're in, unless they have committed an impeachable crime, or they can be impeached, they can retire, or they die. Okay? And I put a little, these are my parenthetic notes here, letter A and B. This exempts them from intimidation from Congress or the president or people over the decisions they need to make. They're supposed to choose to interpret the Constitution and interpret the law without going to public polling, unlike everybody else. There's, to a certain extent, the House, the Senate, and the President should know what the public think. They're the people's representatives, okay, to a certain extent. Letter B, it also keeps the justices from having to run for re-election. We see what happens when politicians have to run for re-election. We don't want that from our justices. All right, Section 2, the cases that the Supreme Court hears. Number 1, the Supreme Court hears cases that directly involve the Constitution. Number 2, also foreign ambassadors or suits involving states go directly to the Supreme Court. So a good historical example here, Bush v. Gore, election of 2000. That had to do directly with the Constitution and a federal election, so it went straight to the Supreme Court. The United States versus Richard Nixon. When Nixon was being forced to hand over the Watergate tapes, the 18 minutes of missing tape from the Oval Office and the Watergate scandal. U.S. versus Nixon, straight to the Supreme Court. In other cases, it is an appellate or appeals court. Trials are to take place in their home states first. Okay? And then, interestingly, unrelated to the court system, but related, Section 3 of Article 3 are the grounds for treason. Our founding fathers wanted to clearly define what treason was because in Old England, the king could accuse you of treason and you had no recourse. They could make anything that, it's like the way we use misinformation today. I was listening to an interview last night on the news, and the news anchor was accusing the reporter. It was the press secretary, White House press secretary. She's accusing the reporter of misinformation, and he's saying, "I just read to you a quote from President Biden. How is that misinformation?" So misinformation is just a label they throw on things. Treason was the label King George threw on everything. So they wanted to clearly define treason. It's only making war against the United States or helping her enemies to do so, or giving aid or comfort to her enemies. No one can be convicted of treason unless 2 witnesses give testimony or the defendant testify in open court. That's an example of where we see the Bible in the Constitution. That's a direct quote from the Bible. In the old Hebrew law, when Moses was giving the law, the death penalty could only be given on account of on a crime that was attested to by 2 or more witnesses. Okay? And then number 3, somebody who's convicted of treason is punished as Congress sees fit. And then they threw in a little there called corruption of blood. There shall be no corruption of blood. And what that means is that a person's family does not share the guilt of a treasoner's treason. Again, Old England. If I committed treason, my wife and kids, they're all going to the Tower of London with me. That's not going to happen here in America. If I commit treason, it's just my crime, not my wife and kids, or my brothers, or my dad, or whatever. Okay? Any questions from Article 3? They get shorter and shorter as we go. If you look in your pocket Constitution, look at Article 4. That's over on page 14. This is nicknamed the Full Faith and Credit Clause. Section 1, full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and the judicial proceedings of every other state. So if you look over at your notes, Section 1, full faith and credit between states regarding public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. Section 2 outlines some privileges and immunities. Citizens in all states are entitled to privileges of the other states. A fugitive who flees one state cannot get protection if he's committed a crime. The 2 governors of the states have to work together to bring fugitives back in. And then Section 4 is a really big one. If you're an underliner or a highlighter, it's a protection clause. The United States will guarantee a Republican form of government. That's not a capital R, it's a little r. That's a representative government. It's the opposite of a democracy. Well, not the opposite, but it's distinguished from a democracy. Protection from foreign invasion, and when necessary, protection from domestic violence. So when a president takes the oath of office and says, "I will faithfully execute the Constitution of the United States," and then they don't enforce the laws, that's why it's a big deal. That's what the oath of office is all about. When you're the president, you're supposed to enforce the laws. Now, of course, there has to be some discretion, because not everything is black and white, but securing our country from foreign invasion is pretty black and white. Securing our country against domestic terror is pretty black and white. And those things have not been enforced. Hopefully you can distinguish between when I'm just talking about the Constitution and when I'm opining. This is my opinion, and I'm just speaking for myself on that. Flip the page on your notes. Article 5, we already talked about it in an earlier session. Oh, it's still on the front page, I'm sorry. That's amending the Constitution. Just a reminder, 2/3 of the states can propose an amendment, and then 3/4 of the states must ratify, or 2/3 of the states can call for a new constitutional convention, just like the one in 1787. But anything that they vote on at that convention, which has never happened, but anything they would vote on would need to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So the 2/3 is, I think that's 34, and then the 3/4 is 38 states. So it's a high bar. It's a high bar to change the Constitution, which is another genius of the Founding Fathers. They had this weird notion that laws should not be changed flippantly. You know, like from one administration to another, a significant law should not just be undone from one administration to the next. That Congress should have to pass laws, again, going back to the administrative state, when those bureaucracies can be legislator, executive, and judicial all in one unelected body, then we don't have protection. We don't have consistency. We don't have rule of law. All right? Article 6 deals with debts. All debts acquired before the Constitution were valid against the United States. Section 2, the Constitution is to be the ruling law of the land. And then Section 3, all leaders, state and federal, must be bound by the oath, but no religious test shall ever be given. That was again, a reaction to what was happening in England at the time. The Church of England was supreme. And in America, there were all these denominations of Christianity, and they wanted to make sure, we'll talk about the separation of church and state, but our founders wanted to make sure that there was no religious test, meaning you didn't have to attest to being a particular denomination or any religious belief in order to take the oath of office. It was understood that most people of that time respected the Bible and Judeo-Christian values, but they wanted to be very careful that you didn't have to meet some sort of metric of being a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist or a Baptist or a Quaker or nothing in order to be able to hold public office in our country. And then Article 7 is just the ratification. 9 out of 13 states have to ratify for it to become the law of the land. So that's it. Those are the 7 articles of the Constitution. And then it has been ratified amended 27 times. And I've typed out either the text of the amendments in your notes or my paraphrase of those amendments. I would like to read through, I'm not going to read through all 27, but I would like to read through 7 of the first 10 because they'll be fairly familiar to you and they're really important. The First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that's called the Establishment Clause, we'll talk about that later tonight, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof, so that's the Free Exercise Clause, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I'll say one thing here, because I'm going to talk about religion a little bit later on, but the free press. The free press, there's a reason these things were all in the First Amendment. Okay? And the free press was one of the most important things to our founders, and we see what's happening today. Just think about the social media companies and the policing that some of our government officials would like us to do, and they openly talk about it. They're not even hiding the ball. They're saying the quiet part out loud, that we need to have some control over what information gets out there. And so free speech, by definition, means that other people are free to say things that I might disagree with. Other people are free to say things that I might find obscene. Why is that important? Why do I want somebody to have the freedom to say something that I find offensive? Because what if what I have to say they find offensive? And if they have the authority to shut me up simply because they find it offensive, then we're all in danger of not having any free speech. Who gets to be the arbiter of what truth is? Who gets to be the arbiter of hate speech? We hear that a lot today. We need to have laws against hate speech. My question is, who gets to decide what makes hate speech? Because right now, if I stand up and I say that I believe that marriage should be between one man and one woman, that's hate speech by some people's definition. I don't want to live in a country that says we have free speech, but then regulates the speech based on someone's religious belief. Does that make sense? So speech is a really big deal, free speech. So just keep that in mind as we continue through our lives, however long God gives us and however long God continues to give America influence and freedom, because that's a big deal right now. There are a lot of people who are actively seeking to curb free speech. The courts have done a good job, in many cases, curbing speech in an appropriate way. You can't threaten someone's life. You can't call for violent insurrection. So we do have good regulations on free speech, but we have to be careful. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia, being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Third Amendment, no soldier in a time of peace shall be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. So no quartering of troops allowed. That was an American Revolution thing. The soldiers could knock on your door and say, you have to house us and feed us for the next foreseeable future. Our founders wanted to put that protection in place. The Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, and papers against unreasonable searches and seizures. So it's a protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. It's a protection against, you have to have a warrant. So law enforcement has to have a warrant for searching and seizing, or at least probable cause. The Fifth Amendment has several things in it, so I paraphrased it. Nobody can be punished for a capital crime unless indicted by a grand jury, nor be put into double jeopardy. That means you can't be convicted of the same crime twice. So if you're convicted of a crime, you serve your time, they can't bring you back in and charge you for the same crime. That's what no double jeopardy means. That was happening back in Old England, okay? You cannot be a witness against yourself in a criminal case. You cannot be forced to admit that you did something wrong. That's a really big deal. Because in Old England, they tortured confessions out of people. In the Catholic Inquisition, they tortured confessions out of people. So we wanted to be able to say, in America, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. The state has to prove that I did something. Even if I did it, I don't have to stand in front of a judge and admit to doing it. I can plead not guilty, and they have to prove that I did it. That's a wonderful protection. Brand new in American history. Didn't exist before America's founding fathers. You can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So can you be deprived of property with due process? Yeah, this is where eminent domain comes in. They can deprive you of your property, but due process has to happen. They can deprive you of your life, but due process has to happen. You have to be convicted of a capital crime. Okay? Sixth Amendment, the right to a speedy and a public trial by an impartial jury of the state and the district wherein the crime is committed. And you have to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. You have to be confronted with the witnesses against him. This is a hard one. If a crime is committed against you, the witnesses who are accusing you have the right to, or actually they have the requirement, you have to face your accusers. And that makes it really difficult in crimes where there's victims involved. But it's an important protection because otherwise people can be wrongly convicted of things if people can anonymously testify that a crime was committed. Okay? The Seventh Amendment, trial by a jury for common suits, and no fact tried by a jury shall be re-examined in another court except by a law. Eighth Amendment, no excessive bails, no cruel and unusual punishment, and no excessive fines. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So that's the protection that they put in to say, in case we forgot to enumerate or list any rights, that can't be used as an excuse to deprive people of those rights. And then the 10th Amendment, we hear a lot of that in conservative circles these days. The power is not delegated to the United States by this Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. One example of this one is people who are in favor of abolishing the federal Department of Education. I heard former President Trump say that recently again. He said it when he ran the first time. He said it again recently that if he wins, he's going to work very hard to try to abolish the federal Department of Education. That's a 10th Amendment issue, okay? The people who would support that would say, there's nothing in the Constitution about a federal mandate to educate our children. That's always been a local and state thing up until 1976. I think Jimmy Carter was the one who brought in the Department of Education, 1977. And Ronald Reagan said he would abolish it. He got a little preoccupied. He got shot, and then he decided he wanted to focus on winning the Cold War. So we'll give him a pass. I am biased. Ronald Reagan's my favorite. 1980s is the greatest decade of human history. Ask my students. I talk about it a lot. 1990s was the greatest movie-making decade of human history. But the 1980s, best decade ever, happens to be the decade I was born in, at the very beginning of that decade, before you scorn my youth. All right. The 11th Amendment establishes the sovereignty of each state. The 12th Amendment we talked about back during the executive branch. It says that we no longer have the runner-up of the presidential election becoming the vice president. That only happened for the first 3 elections, and then they fixed it. The 13th, 14th, and 15th. If you are a note taker, I call these the Reconstruction Amendments. So we got those 3 main sections of the amendments. The first 10 are the Bill of Rights. 13, 14, and 15 are the Reconstruction. These were all passed shortly after the Civil War, 1865 to 1868, I believe. So the Civil War ended in 1865. I would highly recommend a movie it's just called Lincoln. Daniel Day-Lewis plays the role of Lincoln. It was made 10 years ago now, maybe. And it really highlights Lincoln's push to get the 13th Amendment ratified. It would happen after he was killed, but it was really, he understood the Emancipation Proclamation had limitations, so he wanted a constitutional amendment that would ban slavery forever. It was a really, really good movie. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to freedmen. Freedmen was the historical term for former slaves. They called them freedmen, okay? All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. Just to give you a quick analysis here, this was intended for freed slaves. It has been used in the 20th century for immigration purposes. If you've heard of the phrase anchor baby, that's where this comes from. Because women who are pregnant know that if they have their baby on U.S. soil, that baby is a citizen based on the 14th Amendment. Okay? The mother does not have citizenship rights necessarily just by having a baby here, but that baby is a citizen because of the way the 14th Amendment reads. Okay? It reestablishes some things from the Fifth Amendment about life, liberty, and property and the due process of law. So it repeats some things. But again, it was a Reconstruction Amendment. It was meant specifically to apply to freed slaves so that their lives, their liberty, their property could not be taken without due process of law. Number 3, ex-Confederate officials were prohibited from holding public office. And then number 4, ex-Confederate states cannot hold the United States liable for debt. So those were all pretty specific provisions that didn't last past the first few years. And then the 15th Amendment gave voting rights to black men, freedmen. All right, then we have the Progressive Amendments. The Progressive Amendments are 16 through 21. 16 through 21. So 16 is income taxes. Yes, the American people decided, you know what would be a really good idea? Let's let the government take some of our income at the federal level for taxes. We had local income taxes before that. We had state income taxes before that. But the federal government only generated revenue through tariffs and import taxes and business taxes. But during the Progressive Era, remember, Progressive Era is government is the solution to all of our problems. The general idea was that those rich guys, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Schwab, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, those guys aren't paying their fair share. You ever heard that phrase? Okay? I'd love one person, just one, ask the person who uses the phrase fair share, could you define that for me? How would you define fair share? What percentage do you think would be fair? wish one person would just ask. It's not even that hard of a question. All right. So yeah, we gave Congress the authority to tax our income because the American people were told that it would be only for the rich. Only the rich people would be the ones that would be subject to this, and of course we all know that over time, we all get the privilege of paying our income to the Uncle Sam. 17th Amendment was senators are directly elected by the people. 18th Amendment, the prohibition of the manufacture, sale, or transportation, but not the consumption of intoxicating liquors. The Prohibition era is a really fun period of our history to study. Probably wasn't that fun to live through in some ways, but it's a fun period to study. A lot of head-scratching things happening during that time. If you want to skip ahead, the 18th Amendment will be repealed by the 21st Amendment. So if we have 27 amendments, we really only have 25 in effect. Okay, because the 21st Amendment, after 12 years of that experiment, they said, nah, that was not good. It led to crime, it led to gangs, it led to NASCAR. That's a true story. Do you know that? Not NASCAR directly, but car racing. Because the bootleggers would tweak their car engine so they could outrun the federal alcohol officials. And then when alcohol was legalized, it was like, well, we've got all these fast cars now. What do we do for fun? Let's race them. And that's a very simplistic explanation of how car racing became a professional sport, thanks to Prohibition. All right, the 18th Amendment, I did that. 19th Amendment is the voting rights for women. So 19th Amendment was voting rights for women. 20th Amendment is the lame duck amendment. We talked about this when we did Article 2, changed the inauguration day from March 4th to January 20th. Number 2, laugh out loud, Congress has to meet at least once per year on January 3rd. 21st Amendment, as I said, repeals the 18th. The 22nd Amendment limits a president to 2 terms or 10 years maximum. The 23rd Amendment gave Washington, D.C. electoral votes according to its population, but no more than the least populous state, so 3. They could have just said 3, okay? But they have to put things in fancy language. No more than the least populous state. So again, just to recap, we have 435 members of the House of Representatives. We have 100 senators. So that's 535 members of Congress. So the Electoral College then is 538 because of these 3 electoral votes given to Washington, D.C. All right, so 538 divided by 2 and rounded up to the nearest whole number is 270. So that's why the president, a person running for president needs 270 votes in the Electoral College because somebody has to get a majority. Just for laughs and giggles, it's possible to have a 269 to 269 tie. So even if 2 people are running against each other, it is possible to end in a tie. But many of our elections, there were 3 or more people running, which is why a couple times no one reached a majority. What would happen if Trump and Harris were to tie at 269 apiece, it would go to the House of Representatives. But each state only gets 1 vote then in the House. So Pennsylvania has 17 congressmen. Those 17 congressmen would all cast a vote for one or the other, and then the majority of those 17, if let's say Trump, I think we have, of our 17 congressmen, I want to say 11 of them are Republicans. So Trump would win Pennsylvania in that scenario, but that would be 1 vote for Pennsylvania. It would only be 50 votes being cast, and somebody has to win 26 of those 50. Okay? Does that make sense? So I believe that's the plurality scenario, and I believe that because of the makeup of the House of Representatives right now, the Republican would likely be the winner because there are more states that have a Republican majority in their delegation than Democrats. So it would be kind of cool to see that happen just for history. Just the history nerd in me would like to see that provision that was built in there that has only happened a couple times, but I'd prefer just a decisive victory instead. All right, the 24th Amendment, voting cannot be denied because of the failure to pay a poll tax. Note takers can write down this as part of the civil rights movement. Notice the date, 1964. So black people were still being deprived of the right to vote if they couldn't pay a poll tax. That's a tax that you have to pay in order to vote. And Congress tried to prohibit this, the president tried to prohibit this, but states continued to violate it, so we passed a constitutional amendment to make sure that no state could say, well, we here in Mississippi, we run our own elections and this is the way we want to run it. Well, now they can't because the federal constitution is the law of the land. All right? 25th Amendment, we talked about that when we did the executive branch. It further clarifies the succession of the presidency. 26th Amendment is the right of the citizens who are 18 years of age or older. So this lowered the voting age to 18, from 21 to 18. Notice the year 1971. This is a reaction to the Vietnam War. If you're old enough to go and be drafted into the military and go potentially die for your country, you are old enough to vote for the people who are sending you. So we lower the voting age from 21 to 18. And then the 27th Amendment, 1992 was the most recent time our Constitution was amended. This amendment was actually proposed back with the Bill of Rights in 1791, but it didn't get a 3/4 majority until 1992. So no law varying the compensation for services of Congress can go into effect until the next 2-year election has happened. So if Congress votes for themselves to have a raise right now, that raise can't go into effect until after the November election. That gives the people a chance to tell the Congress whether or not we approved of that raise that they gave themselves. So I want to go back quickly to Article 3. I skipped over the judiciary today. So I talked about the Supreme Court. Originally there were 5 Supreme Court justices, and today there are 9. We went from 5 to 7 at one point, and there are 9 today. We also have courts of appeals. There are 13 appellate courts. They're called the U.S. Courts of Appeals. Their main task is to determine if the law was applied correctly at the trial court level. These courts consist of 3 judges. These are federal judges and no jury. So federal judges and Supreme Court justices, when there's a vacancy, the president appoints somebody, and then the Senate has to vote to confirm that person. So when there's a Supreme Court vacancy, you'll hear about the president's short list. The president has a team of people who are part of and Congress actually has a say in this because the Senate has a judiciary committee, and so the president will typically be given a short list of names by his advisors, and those Supreme Court justice nominees come from these federal judges, and then these federal judges are also up for, President Trump got 3 Supreme Court appointments when he was president. President Biden has gotten 1, but most presidents get dozens of federal judge appointments during their 4-year term because there are 90, what does it say up there? There are 90-something. Oh yeah, district courts and federal courts, 13 appellate courts, 94 district courts. Those are all federally appointed judges. All right? A little note here, the Supreme Court hears about 100 to 150 appeals of more than 7,000 cases that it is asked to review every year. So the Supreme Court is asked, there are cases that are sent to them about 7,000 every year, and they only pick 100 to 150 depending on the year. So they're very selective, and they typically try to pick the cases that only deal most directly with the Constitution. Okay? What's that? So if your case is in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court denies it, then whatever the Court of Appeal decided is the final decision. Yep. So whatever the highest court below that was, that's the final decision for that case. All right. So I want to just finish up by talking about I talked about the founding era and the philosophy. I talked about the shift to progressivism. There's one more shift that I think is really relevant to where we are today, and I want to go through that very quickly. So the change from progressivism to critical theory. This was given the name the New Left. If you study U.S. history, if you look in a history textbook, you'll get to the 1960s and you'll see part of the textbook talks about the New Left. Okay? It's become more commonly understood in recent years that the New Left is really this whole idea of, you probably have heard of critical race theory. Critical theory is really the underlying foundation for what became known as the New Left. So just to review, progressivism believes that government exists to be the solution for society's ills. Government is a change agent that's meant to be used for good. Thus, the administrative state, which is experts who write, execute, and judge their own laws, is necessary. Under the progressives, we have the rule by the elite. All right? The New Left is rooted in critical race theory. Let me get my notes in front of me. So critical theory defined, it's really difficult. You have to kind of read through this a couple times and digest it. So that's why I gave it to you in your notes, because we don't have time to do that tonight. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, and I'll try to give you some, like a Reader's Digest version. But it's a social theory that aims to critique and change society as a whole. It attempts to find underlying assumptions in social life that keep people from fully participating in true democracy. It focuses on challenging the power structures. So if you can just keep that phrase in mind, challenging the power structures in society as the source of all the social problems and the root obstacle to human liberation. This comes from Germany. It comes from the Frankfurt School. They were expelled out of Germany during Hitler's reign because he was very anti-communist. They came to America. This took root in the 1930s and 40s, and by the mid-60s, we see the fruition of critical theory. Christian Fuchs was a philosopher who said the goal of critical theory is the transformation of society as a whole so that a just society with peace, wealth, freedom, and self-fulfillment for all can be achieved. A precondition for such a society is the abolition of classes, exploitation, and all forms of domination. What does that sound like? The abolition of classes. It's brainwashing our kids, that's right. But what ism is that? Socialism, which is rooted in, named after a guy, Marx. So it's Marxism. It's a coded language for Marxism. So let's look at some primary areas of example for critical theory. All right? Western/Christian structures are inherently racist, bigoted, and discriminatory and need to be uprooted and deconstructed. The reason I'm talking about this is because it's in context of studying the Constitution. I'm hoping that this will sort of like light bulbs, you'll be able to see where we see, you'll be able to realize where we see evidence of this in today's culture and in today's society, in our education system, in our culture, in our politics. Okay? So let's look at some of these things that critical theory says have to be torn down because they're part of the old power structure. All right? Biblical morality. The nuclear family. Think of the sexual revolution that took place in the 60s and 70s. That was a direct attack on the nuclear family, on the idea that a man and a woman should get married and they should procreate and have a family, the biblical model that God gave us. The church, historically understood, is a powerful organization that, to a critical theorist, has done nothing but oppress people. It's the opiate of the masses, right? So the church and the idea of church having a role in society needs to be deconstructed, all right? Republican or representative government needs to be replaced with pure majority rule. Capitalism and the free market, it's inherently unfair. Capitalism brings out winners and losers, right? The free market brings out winners and losers. Meritocracy could be a parenthetic to that. The whole idea of a meritocracy, it's not fair. It's inherently unfair. All right? Nationalism, the idea that some nations are better than others. Authority, conservatism. One of my kids asked me a couple weeks ago, Dad, what does it mean to be a liberal and what does it mean to be a conservative? It's pretty simple. Liberal means you want to break free of tradition. It means you want to liberate from tradition. Conservative means you want to hold on to tradition. Okay? So if we call ourselves conservatives, we're wanting to hold on to biblical Judeo values, limited government, Republican representative government rather than democracy. Conserving the old things is very much antithetical to a critical theorist. And exceptionalism. The idea that America is exceptional is anathema to a critical theorist, because all countries, it's one world, right? Here are some more thoughts from critical theory. People need to be liberated from oppressive conformity to traditional American life. Have we seen an attack on our traditions in the past half century? Okay? Think of the TV shows. The sitcom Dad. Think of the 90s movies where there was just like the funny character in the movie was the gay guy. And it was like edgy to have the gay, funny, comedic relief in the movie, right? You guys remember that? It was subtle. And it has shifted massively. Intersectionality is the key. Here's what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is the different levels of victim status that you have. Okay? So if you think of the victim groups, not my words, but the victim groups as defined by people who would hold to this worldview, women are a victim group, historically speaking. People of color, so black or brown people, are victims. Homosexuals, transgenders. Okay, so the idea with intersectionality is that the more of those you have, the more disadvantaged you are, and the more society owes you. It's this whole idea of privilege. Okay, so as a white, straight Christian male, I'm like all the bad things in the world. Okay? I'm not trying to be cute, and I'm not trying to be controversial. This is really what people are being taught. All right? Equity is a virtue to a critical theorist. Redistribution is a result of the push for equity. Think about the wealth gap. How many times have we heard a politician say that the income gap between the super rich and the poor is too big? Where did that idea even come from? When did it become acceptable that there's not supposed to be some sort of a gap? That if the gap between Elon Musk and the minimum wage worker is yay big, that there's something inherently wrong with the system. Where did that even come from? It comes from critical theory. If some are wealthy, they have stolen it from the poor. That's a Marxist thought. Marxism teaches that people who are wealthy have gotten wealthy on the backs of the poor. They've exploited the masses. All right? Social justice. Think about social justice. So critical theory is progressivism is all about using the government as a change agent to sort of lift society and try to fix society's ills from the external view. Critical theory and this new left philosophy is all about catering to the minority. Okay? Here's a couple of examples. Miranda. Do you know what the Miranda rule is? You'll recognize it once I start saying it. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you by the court. Do you understand these rights? Then the hand goes on the head, and then they tuck the person. And I watched Cops a lot in the 90s, okay? That comes from a Supreme Court case in 1963, Ernesto Miranda v. Arizona, Supreme Court case. Ernesto Miranda raped a woman. He was arrested. He confessed to the crime. The ACLU got involved and said, "Did you know you had a Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate yourself?" And he said no. And the Supreme Court eventually ruled that because he was not told about his Fifth Amendment right, his confession could not be used against him to convict him of that crime, and he was set free. It's taking an extreme example of the exception and forming all of society around that. Okay? The O.J. Simpson trial. The narrative is that black people have been historically oppressed, that the incarceration rate is too high for black people, and now we have a black celebrity on trial for murder. and he clearly committed the murder. He would later admit to it. But what was the conviction based on? Guilt. Not guilt of his crime, but the guilt of what we as a society have done to black people as the white dominant society. Okay? And think about trans rights. That's another example that comes to mind. I mean, my heart breaks for people who have gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a real thing. Okay? It is an infinitesimally small percentage of the population that deals with this. And what have we done in the past few years? We have elevated this, and we have said we have to form the rest of society around some people who have for intersex people, it's a biological condition, it's a mutation, but for people who don't have the physical issue of that, they have the mental, it's a psychological disorder, but we're supposed to affirm it, and we're supposed to condone it, and we're supposed to change all of our bathroom policies, and we're supposed to change our sports policies. And now we have a social contagion where we have a generation of youth who are confused, because if I ever had a thought one time, a fleeting thought that maybe I was, now I've got all these people telling me, you should embrace that, you should explore that. Okay? So, more from critical theory. Inequality is okay, and I'm going to end on a good note, okay, just to put that out there. Inequality is okay under critical theory as long as it favors the disadvantaged. There's no such thing as black racism due to the power structures. I've actually listened to debates about this, that people will attest that there's no such thing as black people cannot be racist, because racism is all about the power structure. It's not about a skin color. And black people have no power in America, therefore it's impossible for them to be racist. So if you deny something to an Asian person, like they do at Harvard was taken to court last year because they were denying admittance to qualified Asian students, they were denying admittance to qualified Asian students in favor of black students, and that was deemed to be not racist by Harvard because black people have a historical disadvantage over Asian people. Therefore, it's okay to discriminate as long as you're elevating the underprivileged class. Okay? Any criticism of Hamas or Hezbollah is always accompanied by, be careful about Islamophobia. So it's taking the minority and it's elevating them to a status and shaping the rest of culture around that. Okay? It elevates the elevation of nature above humans. So the whole move to get rid of fossil fuels, regardless of the feasibility or the cost. You know, if some people had their way, we would get rid of all fossil fuels and just disregard the high standard of living that we have all become accustomed to thanks to fossil fuels. Okay? Discrimination in favor of non-European immigrants. And finally, America should promote democracy abroad over U.S. interests. So literally in the recent days, we've heard about hundreds of millions of dollars being designated for Ukraine and Lebanon, and yet our hurricane victims are coming up short with funding. That's critical theory. That's saying anybody who used to be part of a ruling class or have some sort of a power structure that was in their favor, that privilege, those people now have to be squashed down so that we can elevate these others. And we see it in our government, we see it in the court system. So the New Left is critical of the administrative state because different groups are underrepresented. The government should exist to promote the rights of the less advantaged, even at the expense of promoting people's self-esteem and their feelings, even if that is over the majority. So like I said, I picked on the legislative and the executive. I want to pick on the judicial very briefly because we see this philosophy playing out in our court system. Two examples, the separation of church and state. So going back to the 1960s, really quickly, the separation of church and state, that phrase comes from Thomas Jefferson. It was a private letter that he wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. They were concerned, this is the early 1800s, he was president at the time, they were concerned that the government was going to come in and encroach on the Baptists for their beliefs, and Baptists historically had been a persecuted sect of Protestantism. Thomas Jefferson said, you don't have to worry about that. The First Amendment erects a wall of separation between church and state. okay? That phrase was grabbed out of Jefferson's letter and brought into a Supreme Court case called Everson v. Board of Education in 1947. And then later in Engel v. Vitale in 1962, it was used to ban prayer in public schools. Every student used to stand at the beginning of the day and they recited this prayer together. It was optional, but they had to at least stand. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence on Thee and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Amen. That's how school started every day before this case. Moving on then, Lemon v. Kurtzman, 1971. This established a test to determine whether government action comports with the Establishment Clause. The Lemon test put 3 rules in place for laws. This is the Supreme Court writing law. We've got our Constitution that says Congress makes the laws. Progressives give us FDR and the New Deal, where presidents now send their bills to Congress for the rubber stamp. We've flip-flopped that. And now we get into the late 20th century and we have an activist court that is now using, with a philosophy of critical theory, of elevating that minority, the underprivileged, and Christianity has been the dominant religion, so we have to watch out for the 4% of our population at the time that claims to be atheist. Those people need to be elevated because we have to tear down the structures of the old Western order. The Lemon test has 3 tests. It said any law has to, number 1, have a non-religious purpose. Number 2, the primary purpose of the law must neither advance nor inhibit religion. And number 3, it must not result in excessive entanglement of government with religion. They've completely rewritten the agreement between the United States people and their government when it comes to how religious belief informs what we do as people. Okay? And this is where we get our public school curriculum that begins to use what they call a values-neutral curriculum. Because it can't be religious. It won't be allowed because separation of church and state. How do you have a values-neutral curriculum? Someone's going to decide what those values are. Someone's religious worldview is going to decide what those values are. It's preposterous. So since then, since the Lemon case in 1971, 2 years before Roe v. Wade, same activist court, Pledge of Allegiance was ruled unconstitutional in California, later was struck down by the Supreme Court, but that was a whole fight because of the phrase under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Creationism is banned in public schools due to its religious nature. That was actually right here in PA, the Dover School District. That was probably 20 years ago now. Dover School District was teaching creationism alongside of evolution, and they said you can't do that because creation science is based on the biblical account, and that's not separation of church and state. You're promoting a religion. Public displays of the Ten Commandments and crosses have been banned in courthouses, public buildings, etc. And then there are continuous battles over Christian groups on public schools, sorry about that, churches using public school facilities, coaches praying with their teams. Those battles are happening all over the place. I encourage you to look up the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF. They're a wonderful organization that helps people like the coach who was fired from the public school football coach. He joined his teammates who were voluntarily praying at the end of the game. He didn't lead the prayer. He didn't participate in the prayer. He stood there as a Christian man with his Christian athletes and the opposing team Christian athletes for prayer at the end of the game, and he was fired because as a public school employee, that's a mixing of church and state, and you're not allowed to do that. He won his case, but he had to spend lots of money and lots of time fighting it. So the ADF helps with those kinds of things. All right, one more example about our activist court with this critical theory mindset. Rights of the accused, I talked about Miranda v. Arizona. Another example is Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. The court ordered that states will provide lawyers for defendants who could not afford them. So this is where they took the Fourth Amendment and said you have the right to a legal defense, and they said, well, we're going to throw on top of that if you can't afford one, the state will pay for one for you. Okay? So we see how, well, I hope you can see, I had to make a very fast connection, but critical theory, its main tenets and how that has really infused all 3 branches of government but in particular here, our court system is very much influenced by critical theory. And critical race theory, if critical theory is tearing down any old power structures, critical race theory just adds the race element as a specific item into it, saying that in America, white culture has always been the dominant culture, therefore, that's where we have to elevate other races and which it's ethnicities. Mr. Gaiman, our science teacher, will give you a whole lesson if you want on how race isn't really even a thing. We're all one race. We're the human race. We just have different pigments. Some of you are lighter than me, and I'm darker. Yeah, anyway. Mr. Gaiman does a great job with that, but that's not my area, so I'll stay out of it. Sorry, one more thing that's not in my PowerPoint, but it is in my notes. Just to finish, get all the negative out of the way. Let's just look at the family and how the effects of critical theory, what we've done by taking the minority. Here's another example: teen pregnancy or unwed pregnancy. Okay, we took what was a pretty small population, pretty small percentage of the population in the 1950s that a young girl would get pregnant and not be married, and we decided we don't want to stigmatize that. We want to remove the stigma. We want to remove the shame from that act. So what we did was we began actively teaching sex ed. We began actively handing out contraceptives to students in high schools, taxpayer funded. And I just want to show you some of the data. And 1965, 24% of black babies that were born in America were born to an unwed mother in 1965. 24% of blacks born to unwed mothers and 3.1% of whites. 1990, 64% of blacks, 18% of whites. In 2022, 70% of blacks. 70% of black babies born in our country today are born to a fatherless home. Have we really progressed as a society? The welfare is a big part of that, for sure. Yep, and 28% for whites. So a quarter of white babies born in America today are... Now, the divorce rates have begun to decline, but that's probably because people just aren't getting married. They're just living together. Welfare programs is another one of those examples. We incentivize bad behavior. There used to be moral requirements. If you were going to receive government assistance, there was a certain morality by which you had to live your life. We've removed all of that, and we see an increase in those negative behaviors. No-fault divorce is another one. These have all been very intentional ways to try to move us away from the biblical understanding of the family. Very intentional, very subversive. All right? So, where does this leave us? We'll go to the negative, and then I'll end with some positive. All right? So where does this leave us? We have a legislative branch and an executive branch who make little to no effort to administer sound financial policy. Rules, this is just sort of zooming out and looking at the Constitution as a whole and our government as a whole as it stands today. Rules have been created to bypass the constitutional process for lawmaking, omnibus legislation, executive orders, etc. Number two, we have a bloated administrative state who have vast control over our lives but little to no accountability. Number three, we are closer to a democracy than the founders wanted, which some people would say is a very good thing. And I hope I've presented it a compelling case that it's not a good thing, that the direct election of senators removed a major check in the legislature that was supposed to be a good thing, and that I didn't even talk about referendums and initiatives, that we can actually vote on, depending on what state you live in, there's a lot of issues that will be on a ballot. You're not just choosing your representatives, you're actually directly voting on issues. Okay, and that gets us away from what the founders said. The founders saw that as mob rule, that the passions of the mob will lead to the tyranny of the majority, and we've become we've come closer to that. We have an activist court system, and I didn't even go here, and I won't go here, but the two-party system has some serious limitations. Yeah, enough said about that. Two-party system was not written into the Constitution, by the way. It's just the way our history has played out. But on the positive side, what do we have? Our Constitution is still largely intact after 237 years. It has only had to be amended 27 times. That's remarkable. Our Constitution is still a wonder to the world, and it is still a model for the world. Number 3, we have history on our side. We have the Federalist Papers. We can know what they meant when they wrote certain things in because they told us. And now we can see why those things were good, and we can do our part to try to stick up for those founding principles and to try to fight for reform and to elect good leaders. Number 4, centralized bureaucratic government is unpopular everywhere in the world that it is used. It's becoming less popular in America. That means there's a chance that it could be reformed. It could be improved. It could be reined in. And finally, our Constitution is still a bulwark, at least to some degree, from a total transformation to a democracy. And one of the major things that gives me hope is that the Electoral College is so well ingrained into our Constitution, only a constitutional amendment can change that, and that is extremely unlikely because it is very unlikely that 38 of our 50 states would vote to remove their power from choosing a president. So the Electoral College, if we add Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C., and get 4 more, most likely, left-leaning senators, the presidency, and having every once in a while at least a president who holds our ideals as conservatives, that's likely going to be there for a long time. And that president has the power to affect the Supreme Court significantly, as we've seen in the past 5 years. So there's still a lot to be grateful for. There's still a lot to be thankful for. And there's a lot of positives that we still have. Even with all of the problems that we have, we are a blessed people to have the Constitution that we have. Questions or comments? Yes, sir. Department of Education? Yep. Yeah. No, Congress has a say. Yeah, the Congress has to have a say in the creation of new executive departments. Yep. 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 5 original cabinet members, now we have 15. So, any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
What happens if the president disobeys the Supreme Court? Goes ahead and does what else?
Oh, we've had lots of examples of that in history. Yeah. Yeah, it just depends on who. President Andrew Jackson famously said once, John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it if he can. The recourse is that Congress has to hold the president accountable. If he does something egregious enough, Congress needs to impeach and remove him from office. So there's been lots of examples where the Supreme Court said something and the president totally ignored it. And we're still here, but there were consequences for sure. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Yes?
Do you have any recommendations on further resources to learn about critical theory?
That's the final page that I gave you tonight that I did not talk about. This book, it does not deal as much with critical theory by name, but it deals with the philosophy. It's a book called How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps by Ben Shapiro. This is what my Honors U.S. History students have to read in order to take my class, which I no longer teach. But I taught it for 17 years. There was always a summer reading assignment for the honors class. That's how I weed out those who are not serious about being able to keep up with the rigors of that class. But this was the summer reading for the past 3 or 4 years. And I'm not going to go through this because we're out of time, but you can read through this. But he calls them the disintegrationists or the disunionists. And these are my notes of his book. This is my 2-page summary of his book. It's really, really good. Other critical theory there's a podcast called the Just Thinking Podcast. That's where I got most of my information on critical theory. It's called Just Thinking. So it's like just, like justice, or it could be like just thinking, like only thinking. But Just Thinking is the podcast. It's two black men. One of them is a pastor, I believe. They might both be pastors. They're both religious leaders. One might be a professor at a Christian university. Their names are eluding me right now. But the Just Thinking podcast, there's an episode on critical race theory. This is like for real podcasting. This is like a 3-hour episode, and it's a lot, but it's very good. There's other essays and other things. Hillsdale College is a wonderful resource. Charlie Kirk has written and said things about critical theory that are pretty good. There was one other one I just thought of. Dr. Vadi Bakum, Voddie. I think it's Bacham or Baucham. He's a professor of a seminary in South Africa, but I believe he's American. He has written a lot about conservative thought, and I don't know if he's written specifically about critical theory, but I want to say he has. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
The Constitution's been around for over 200 years, and there's been a lot of technological changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of like airplanes and medicine and
Yeah.
so forth. Is the Constitution, do you think it's adequately dealing with those kind of issues, those kind of advancements?
Yeah, the question is about the Constitution and its ability to deal with technological advancements. I don't think that's a question for the Constitution as much as it is for the elected leaders and the bureaucratic state that has been established. If we were operating strictly by the Constitution, there would be checks and balances to the rule makers of those things. So the bodies that regulate flying, the bodies that regulate our medicine. I mean, think of the CDC. Think of what we went through with COVID and the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the difficulty in finding good information. That's not a Constitution problem. I don't think it's a problem of evolution. And what I mean by that is the way that our country evolved and the way that we as a people continue to elect leaders who created these bureaucracies that have no accountability. If we went back to what the Constitution says, those bureaucracies would get reined in and there would be accountability measures put in place. So I don't think it's a Constitution problem. I think it always comes back to individual hearts. We as a people and the country that we have, we get what we deserve. We've elected these leaders who have created the systems that have given us these difficulties. So.
Yes, I was thinking of also like the issues with Boeing aircraft.
Yeah.
And there was a 737, two of them that went down.
Yep.
And then the recent space
Mm-hmm.
craft that had issues with it.
My answer for that takes us down a path of talking about private venture, getting the government out of things that should be left to the free market. Let our roads get built by, what's the word? Privatize. We need to privatize those things and let the market speak for itself. If Boeing is a private company and they screw up, people are going to stop flying on Boeing. So we need to privatize those things and get the government out. But that's a different subject. So, if we let private companies build our roads and bridges, they could do it faster and cheaper, and the quality would be just as good, because the market would require it. I'm not a big fan of unions, especially government unions, public unions, and that's why. So, you're going to get me going. Anything else? Thank you, folks. Let me close in prayer. I don't think I opened in prayer tonight. Shame on me. Lord, I just thank you for these patriots who have given up of their evenings to come and learn about our Constitution. And Lord, we are grateful for what you've given us. We are blessed. We don't deserve it. The majority of the world lives under a less free system. And we are grateful for what we have here in America. And Lord, help us each to know what we can do besides voting. What else can we do, Lord, to try to reclaim things that would be important to you, biblical values, not for our own glory and not for our own power, but to have us be a nation that comes closer to honoring you than we currently do. So I just thank you for this opportunity, Lord. I thank you for the beautiful weather that we have had here, and Lord, we know that that's not the case in Florida, and so we lift those people to you, and we ask that you would show mercy to the people who seem to be in the path of a hurricane, and Lord, may the rescue effort go quickly. We pray that you would use that to draw people to yourself. Thank you, Father. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I'll hang out for a little bit if anyone wanted to talk more.